Now, this is special planetary aspects, and this is something we have to convey through Vedic astrology. Essentially, each of these planets, particularly Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter, has special aspects. I'm going to give this short thrift because it's a little bit more sort of technological or whatever, methodical than we need to talk about for this more general crash course. But essentially, Saturn has its own special aspects. I should say first that Sun, Moon, Venus, and Mercury all pretty much have the same aspects. It's the conjunction, the trine, and the opposition. Conjunction and opposition are strongest, and then trines are milder. And this is where I have to say the important caveat here of how astrology, Vedic astrology, is very different from the West, because the Western astrology says that trines are always good, because they don't have the concept of friendship or enemies with the planets. So the sun, if the sun is in Capricorn and it's trine to Saturn in Virgo, in the West, that's considered a good thing because it's a trine. In Vedic astrology, the sun aspecting through a trine or opposition or a square, whatever it is just this. It's the same. And that sun it's going to be malefic. The sun is going to burn out whatever it touches, but it's especially going to burn out anything that's an enemy to the sun, because the sun is a malefic and it has enemies. That's why it burns Saturn so hard. Saturn's the same way. Saturn's a malefic and the sun is its enemy. So when these two interact with each other, it's always a bad thing. Interestingly, there's even times where, I often use this metaphor, where there's some times where one planet is a friend to the other planet, but the other planet is an enemy to that planet. This happens in nature. Think about leaving an ice cube out in the sun on a hot day. The sun is melting the ice cube, but the ice cube is not melting the sun, or the ice cube's not freezing the sun. In the same way, look at this example where we think of the fact that the moon has for a friend Mercury, but Mercury has for an enemy the moon. And this goes to show that whenever the moon and Mercury are conjunct, it's a bit of a trade-off, actually. And if Mercury is very important in your chart, like if you're an earth or an air sign, then it's going to be a bad thing, because your emotions are taking over what should be your clear communication. Trying to listen to what's going on outside. An earth or air person should be listening to what's going on outside and not let what's inside them block that. Now, if you're a fire or a water rising sign, and if you've got the moon conjunct Mercury, the moon is going to be delighted because Mercury is a friend to the moon. What happens is that the communication style, you put less emphasis on it and more emphasis on using it to delight yourself. And that's what fire and water signs need. They need to be revved up in order to do the great objectives that they want to do. So it can be a trade-off, and that's just kind of how these things work. Ultimately, what's important to be said is that Vedic astrology is conveying that not all aspects are, trine aspects are not all good. Oppositions and squares are not all bad. It depends on the relationships of the planets. And these planets also have special aspects, like I said. The third house from Saturn, or that meaning if a planet is 60 degrees ahead of Saturn, if a planet is completely opposite, 180 degrees, if the planet is in a trine, or that'll be a milder aspect of Saturn, or if the planet is in the 10th house aspect, the 270 degrees from Saturn, meaning that the planet is in Saturn's 10th house, then that is going to cause Saturn to have an aspect to that thing, whatever that is, whether it's a house cup or a planet. We can see the logic here. The third house from Saturn is a necessary expansion of space for what's needed for the self. The 10th house from Saturn faces the brunt of Saturn's refinement. And these do go by orbs. For example, if a planet is at, let's say, 160 degrees away from Saturn. It's not fully up at that opposition, but it's still close enough to get some aspect from Saturn. It won't be as strong as the full opposition, right? So that's how that logic goes. Mars has its own special aspects. The fourth house aspect, 90 degrees in front of Mars, or if a planet or a house cusp is completely opposite, or if a planet or house cusp is at its eighth house, the eighth house from Mars. So the fourth house has to do with, again, the nature of what Mars is. The fourth house from Mars, even if there's nothing there, there is a signification of some kind of desperation or some kind of pressure that all our Mars is unconsciously put on that space. It's hard to say, Vedic astrology conveys that Mars and the moon are kind of similar to each other. Mars is it's what we go through our terrible twos. The moon is what we go through from age 0 to age like 1.5, and we're only drinking milk. And you either are accepting the milk from the breast or you're not. That is the definition of the moon. You either grab what you need or you don't. That's the time where we make the impressions that are our planets and our chart. The terrible twos, where you're walking around saying, this is mine, I want this candy, I want this candy. This is Mars. This is why Mars has a relationship with the moon, and why that fourth house aspect is there. I digress. I could talk about it forever. But the eighth house aspect is more obvious. The eighth house from Mars is also going to take Mars's full aspect. Now, Jupiter has its own special aspects as well. Essentially, the fourth house from Jupiter, the fifth house from Jupiter, the seventh house from Jupiter, the eighth house from Jupiter, and the ninth house from Jupiter all contain aspects, although they have different degrees of strength. Remember, these aspects are not inherently good or bad. It's the friendship and enmity, as well as the benefic versus malefic, that counts. Like if we were to say, for example, we have Mars, who is, who is Mars neutral to? Mars is neutral to the moon because the moon has no enemies. So if Mars is aspecting the moon, let's say if Mars is here and the moon is in the fourth house from Mars, Mars is giving that moon an aspect. Thankfully, Mars is neutral to the moon, so it won't damage the moon terribly, but Mars is still a malefic, and there would still be some stress on that moon.